Hello students, welcome to my lecture on globalization. Today I'm going to discuss the impact of globalization on the nation state, particularly to what extent it has affected the nation state's sovereignty, identity and its functioning. In fact, you are all familiar with the concept of the Westphalian nation state. In fact, the nation state that originated after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 has been the principal model of the actor in international relations, that is the sovereign state. So the concept of sovereignty has been the principal feature of the nation state. Now, let me remind you about the concept of sovereignty or the idea of sovereignty. Now, it basically means that a particular state is a supreme authority within its own territory. Now, when we talk about nation states, we are also talking about territorial states. Although, of course, there is a lot of debate in political theory as to whether a nation state is strictly always synonymous with or the same thing as a territorial state, because there are a large number of states where, for instance, you have different ethnic groups who may not necessarily be classified as the same nation. But that is a different subject and a different issue. I'm not going into that. But basically, what I'm just reminding you is that sovereignty is the principal feature, has been the principal feature of the nation state in international relations since, let's say, for the last almost 300 years. Now, the forces of globalization actually have led to what is claimed by its critics to a deterritorialization of the nation state. Deterritorialization. Now, I'm sure it's a difficult term to pronounce, but basically what it means that this territorial dimension of the nation state actually is increasingly disappearing because of the disappearance of borders, and boundaries and so on and so forth. Of course, when I say disappearance of borders, I don't necessarily mean that physically these borders are disappearing. Of course, they are not. But notionally, practically, these borders are disappearing because of the transnational character of the phenomenon called globalization. Now, there are three major areas of concern, so far as its impact on the nation state is concerned, and this is what has been pointed out by scholars. Number one, compromise of national economic interests. Number two, curtailment of the nation state's sovereignty. And number three, erosion of national identity. Let me discuss these three aspects in greater detail. Now, so far as the first aspect is concerned, that is the compromise of national economic interest. Now, the present globalization, of course, is a product of, as I have mentioned earlier, the revolution of communication and information technology. Now, this again is something that you are all familiar with, and as a result of this this revolution in communication and information technology, movement of capital across national borders has become much easier. Transnational corporations or multinational corporations are empowered to establish operations across the borders. That is, in other words, to remind you that when we're talking about a multinational corporation, it might have its headquarters in state A, but it might be operating in state B, state C, state D, state E, and so on and so forth, or all across the world. I'm not taking any particular names, but I'm sure you can understand what I'm referring to. So these companies actually are operating across the borders, and so they have also the ability to transfer activities and resources across boundaries at large scale. Now, consequently, what has taken place is an accentuation. Now, accentuation means actually, in other words, a particular process actually becoming stronger, or particular process becoming gathering momentum or gathering pace. That is what the word accentuation means. Accentuation of interdependence, particularly economic interdependence, of these economies, that is the countries where the TNCs are operating on the TNCs concerned, or the TNC investments. Now, this leads to increases in volumes of exchanges between states due to economic interdependence, which I have already mentioned. And this issue of interdependence, actually, the world has never been more interdependent than it is today. And this interdependence actually has been further strengthened by the forces of globalization. This is the point, I think, that any student of today's international relations and political science have to bear in mind. Now, apart from this, of course, another aspect to which I draw your attention, of course, is the raising of capital. That, in other words, that a particular multinational corporation that might raise capital, for instance, not necessarily in one country, but also in more than one country, to support production in other countries. That is, in other words, just to give you a specific example, the multinational corporation may be registered in state A, but it is raising capital in state B and state C to actually invest in state D, state E, state F, state G, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure you can understand how spread out the activity has been. Previously, of course, when the world was not so globalized, a particular company would be confined actually to within the territories of its own country, and that would be its market. That is where it will raise its capital. That is where, for instance, its production will take place, and that is where also it will market its products. But now, actually, that this activity has become far more diffused. That is the point actually I'm trying to make. Now, this capital movement across the boundaries is both a benefit as well as a disadvantage. Why? Because, of course, previously, let me just try to make this distinction clear. Previously, when there were restrictions on capital movement from one country to another, what used to happen is that, once capital came into another country, it could not, move out of that country very easily. But now, of course, because of relaxation of restrictions, capital can move in very freely, but it can also move out very freely. Why this happens? Now, of course, as I said that today, all the countries of the world, particularly the countries in the developing world, they are actually competing for capital investment, from across the border, from external sources. Now, as a result of this competition, what happens is that, when a capital, for instance, comes to a particular country, if after a while it finds that operating in that particular country is no longer very profitable, so what will happen is that it will move out of that country and actually go to another country where it considers that its operations would be much more profitable. Now, this can have a disastrous effect on the country concerned from where actually capital is moving out. And this is what actually led to the economic crisis in Southeast Asia in 1997, that there was a flight of capital. And that led to a consequent pressure on currencies, and these currencies actually, as a result of these currencies actually collapsed. So therefore, it is actually, you can say that this is, on the one hand, you are getting foreign direct investment, so capital is coming in, that is a good thing. You do not have the capital within your own country, so everybody is now trying to attract foreign direct investment, but there is also a downside to this. And this downside has to be kept in mind by students of globalization, political science, and so on and so forth. So what is happening actually as a result, consequently, what is happening is that inequality is increasing, both within the countries concerned as well as among the countries concerned. Because investment actually is going to areas where it is not necessarily always beneficial for the country concerned. And that is consequently leading to inequalities, because what is happening is that, only say those who have greater purchasing power, they are able to buy the products of particularly the multinational corporations, but those who do not have the purchasing power, they are not able to buy these goods. So what is happening is that, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that is the problem that nation states are facing, and they are not always able to look after their national interests as per their own policies, their own preferences, and their own calculations. Secondly, I pass on to the curtailment of nation-state sovereignty. This is the issue with which I started this discussion. The critics argue that globalization is a threat to the nation-state's sovereignty. Now, in what way? Now, let me explain. Now, today, for instance, you have a plethora of international treaties, agreements, and conventions, which actually are international treaties, and so therefore actually they are applicable, they have to be accepted by all the signatory countries which actually have signed these treaties and conventions. So there is increasing pressure on national governments to implement these to satisfy the international community. Just to give you an example, for instance, if there is an agreement or if there is a treaty on the law of the sea, then actually, and if you are a signatory, if a country is a signatory, then it has to follow that international convention on the law of the sea. It may so happen that when it signed, actually, it found that it was to its advantage, but at a later time, it found that this advantage actually was no longer accruing to it. It can also apply to other areas like environment, energy, and any other issue that you can think of. So, national governments are increasingly subjected to demands and standards set out in multilateral treaties on various issues. As a result of it, actually, there is also a greater degree of international scrutiny. In other words, whether the countries who are signatories to these conventions and treaties, they are actually following these treaties or not, this is subjected to international scrutiny. That means actually, in other words, if you do not follow, if the country concerned does not follow it, then of course, it will be subjected to all kinds of penal measures, which will damage its economy and its political and social fabric. Now, let me just draw a contrast to earlier treaties. It is not the case that treaties actually are being signed only after globalization started. Of course, treaties used to be signed much earlier also. But earlier, there is actually a change in the nature of treaties that we are talking about. In the previous scenario, treaties were signed actually, where the national sovereignty was not compromised. Actually, basically, these treaties were earlier treaties I'm talking about. They were signed actually, to strengthen the national sovereignty of the state concerned. So therefore, they did not damage, they did not intrude into domestic jurisdiction as the present phase of treaties actually are doing with regard to globalization. In fact, there is a recent international trend as a result of which there is a tendency to impinge on domestic jurisdictions. So what we find particularly, and this is where I draw your attention, that there is a disruption in distinction between domestic and international affairs. That is, in other words, previously there was a clear wall separating the domestic affairs from international affairs. But now this wall actually is increasingly disappearing. That is, in other words, international issues are now impinging on domestic affairs, and domestic affairs of a particular country, for instance, are getting more internationalized. This is actually a particularly interesting feature, not necessarily a very good feature of globalization. So what is happening is that, national communities, they are suffering a democratic deficit. Now, what do I mean by democratic deficit? What I mean is that previously, that national communities, they had a control over their own affairs. That is, in other words, actually they could decide their own destinies. They could, through their government, through their elected representatives, and so on and so forth. But now what is happening is that, their governments actually are being forced to accept policies which are not necessarily determined strictly domestically, but which also have to take into consideration international communities' concerns, international communities, sometimes international communities' dictates, and so on and so forth. So this is what I mean by democratic deficit. So there is a disruption of choice and of responsibilities between democratically elected governments on the one hand and their national communities by introduction of powerful international financial and diplomacy claiming nation-state accountability. In other words, that these powerful forces of international finance and international diplomacy, they are increasingly dictating the show so far as the domestic affairs of a particular country is concerned. In fact, international organizations I have already mentioned earlier, like World Bank, World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, to whom the nation states are obligated. Now, these are organizations which are not democratically elected. They are, in fact, you find that in most cases, they represent more the interests of the powerful, affluent Western nations. And but if you take into consideration the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, just to give you a specific example, since its creation, the World Bank always has had an American as its president, and International Monetary Fund has always had a European as its director. So, in fact, never in the history of these two institutions, anybody from the developing world has been elected as director or chairman of these. So the concept of absolute sovereignty, which was developed earlier, in earlier conditions of relatively low levels of interdependence, has undergone a change or is undergoing a change. Now, the present complex level of interdependence with large flow of capital, labor, technology, and information, as well as the emergence of changing patterns of sovereignty and its meaning and conditionality, is a very important and noticeable feature of today's globalization, and particularly its effect on the state itself. Now, I've mentioned earlier globalization's impact on social movements, social, political, economic, and ecological issues, which also are now trans-border movements and communications, and these are also impinging or affecting national policies. In fact, in this context, I may also mention the nuclearization of the world and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and their conditionalities and so on and so forth. Finally, I come to the issue of erosion of national identity. Now, this again is a very important question. I mean, identity, as you all know, actually is a very important issue. I mean, national identity, particularly every nation actually cherishes its national identity. Now, this, in fact, there has been pressure on national identity in two ways. Firstly, of course, increased mobility of population across the world, and secondly, advances in global communication networks. Now, population movements, of course, have been stimulated, by the gaps between the advanced, rich, industrialized countries on the one hand and the poor developing countries. Now, in fact, there has been an unprecedented movement of migrants from the poorer countries to the richer countries, and this is actually affecting the identity of these richer countries. So they are actually, there is a backlash as a result of that. Secondly, as a result of the electronic revolution, leading to, this is also leading to erosion of cultural identity through homogenization. I mean, this is something that I have mentioned earlier, that in fact, I mean, the culture of the advanced countries actually is coming into the poorer countries and affecting them. But of course, this is an issue which is affecting both ways, which is a both way transaction. That is, culture of the poorer countries actually, I mean, they are also, because along with the migrants, I mean, they are taking their culture to the countries, to the richer countries where they are going, whether it is in Europe or in the United States or in Canada or Australia and so on and so forth. So finally, in conclusion, we have to say that globalization has been broadly more beneficial to the advanced and industrialized countries. The less developed countries have been more at the receiving end, and globalization has been a process which has been imposed more from the above. And as a result of it, there has been a marginalization of poorer sections of society and poorer countries. So how do we actually assess globalization? Now, of course, globalization is unstoppable. It is not being directed by anybody, but these are forces which have been unleashed as a result of the factors which we have discussed earlier. And so therefore, it cannot be stopped. So what is necessary actually that countries which are being adversely affected, they have to actually adjust themselves and adapt themselves in ways by empowering their people through education and other forms and so on and so forth, empowerment of women and so on and so forth. So in other words, actually they have to adapt themselves, adjust themselves and empower themselves so that they are also not adversely affected, that they also can reap whatever benefits globalization actually has to offer. This actually is the ultimate solution that one can look for in trying to make globalization work for the benefit of all. Thank you.